So good morning, everyone. I like how everyone just got quiet right at once. Terrific. Thank you so much for joining us here in the room, and I think virtually as well. I am Mike Abramowitz, and I am the president of Freedom House. I am absolutely thrilled to welcome Ambassador Power to deliver a speech today on what I believe to be one of the most pressing challenges of our day: what we must do to address the companion crises of backsliding democracy and advancing authoritarianism. The issue is fundamental. What kind of world will we choose to live in? One where people live freely, with the right to speak their minds, choose their own leaders, love whom they choose, and worship or not without fear of persecution? Or one where authoritarian regimes use violence and repression to achieve their goals, denying people their dignity and fundamental freedoms? For those of you who are not familiar with Freedom House, we are the oldest organization in the United States that works to defend and support democracy around the world. We are fundamentally nonpartisan, and we advocate for democracy because we believe that it is the best system for protecting human rights and incubating peace and prosperity. We are well known for our research. In his opening remarks at last December's Summit for Democracy, President Biden noted that the world was in its 15th consecutive year of declining democracy. And that fact comes from Freedom in the World, our flagship report on the state of freedom in the world. And sadly, our most recent edition, published just this past February, has updated that number to 16 consecutive years. But we're not just a research organization. We recognize the importance of matching our research and advocacy with direct support for human rights defenders, journalists, and civil society groups, the people we believe are best equipped to hold their governments to account and press for democracy. I want to thank the U.S. Agency for International Development for being such a dedicated partner in this work. For more than 15 years, the agency has trusted Freedom House to manage the human rights support mechanism, its premier human rights funding stream. And through the collaboration between Freedom House and USAID, our human rights partners around the world have implemented rapid response grants to help democracy advocates escape government persecution in Belarus, document human rights violations in Myanmar and elsewhere, and promote accurate information about COVID-19 to indigenous peoples in the Amazon, and much, much more. Right now, we are working with partners to support Ukrainian human rights defenders and journalists uprooted by the Russian invasion. And I'm just back from a visit to the region where I had the opportunity to meet many of these brave defenders whose determination and selflessness is beyond words. The Ukrainians are in the fight of their lives, and we must do everything we can to help them. But the fight is not limited just to Eastern Europe and Eurasia. According to the latest edition of Freedom in the World, 60 countries experienced democratic declines last year, and only 25 experienced improvements. In terms of people affected, barely 20% of the world's population lives in what Freedom House designates as a free country, with their right to free expression, rule of law, and fair elections, and other rights firmly protected. Just 20%. That's the lowest number we've seen since 1995. Beyond the statistics, we're observing a disturbing accelerating trend of cooperation and support among autocrats, which is fueling the expansion of authoritarianism. One reason for the staying power of the world's worst autocratic regimes in places like Venezuela, Syria, Belarus, to name just three, is the growing support they're getting from Russia, China, and other entrenched autocracies. Dictatorships are also cooperating to intimidate their critics and dissenters living in exile, a deeply worrying phenomenon that Freedom House calls transnational repression, and which we have devoted extensive resources to documenting. Since our founding, Freedom House has recognized that the United States has a special role to play in the fight against fascism and authoritarianism. I don't mean to say that our democracy has been perfect, but without strong leadership from the United States, both through bold action and fidelity to our values, the cause of global democracy will falter. And this is why I'm so eager to hear what Ambassador Power has to say about the US government's role in supporting freedom and democracy. I've known Administrator Power, keep toggling back and forth, Administrator, Ambassador. I've known Samantha Power for 3 decades, and I have never met anyone in public service more committed to realizing the ideal of a values-based foreign policy that puts human rights and democracy front and center. Since her days as a young journalist covering the Balkan Wars, Administrator Power has well understood the role that the United States can play in addressing the world's worst violations of human rights and the profound consequences of choosing not to act. In A Problem from Hell, one of the best nonfiction books I've ever read, she tackled the vexing problem of why the United States has not done more to prevent and stop genocides around the world. And since entering government service, first on the National Security Council, then as the ambassador to the United Nations, and now as USAID Administrator, she has always fought ferociously for the marginalized and those suffering human rights abuses. Administrator Power is humble enough to tell you that this work is full of challenges, and advancing this important mission can sometimes seem terribly slow and full of what may seem like unsatisfying compromises. But she has not wavered in the fight or lost sight of the bigger goals, and I greatly admire her steadfast commitment to the cause of freedom and human dignity for all. So with that, I am deeply honored to turn things over to Ambassador Power. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I want to express my sincere thanks to Michael for that introduction. You should know that by birthright alone, Michael would make it into my list of treasured people. His father, Mort Abramowitz, was my longtime mentor, the voice guiding some of my best decisions and cautioning me against some of my very worst. But Michael, through his work as a reporter at the Washington Post, the leader of the Committee on Conscience at the Holocaust Museum, and now through his stewardship of Freedom House, has proven that he is an ally to the cause of individual dignity like few others. He is also a truly wonderful friend. Since its founding in 1941, Freedom House has been the democratic world's lighthouse. Its peerless research, its convening power, and its advocacy have provided a beacon for those who seek to draw more people to the shores of liberty, while revealing in unflinching detail just how treacherous the course may be to get there. If we're being honest, as Michael described himself, that course has been a dispiriting one in recent years. There is, of course, Freedom House's own research, which for 16 years has now told us that democracy is in decline. Or the report they released last week about transnational repression, about the brazen and shameless behavior of authoritarian governments who not only trample on human rights and commit outright atrocities in their own countries, but also increasingly cross borders to target, threaten, kidnap, or even poison dissidents living abroad. And then there's the state of our own imperiled democracy. The global case for democracy has always been rooted in this country's democratic legitimacy and strength, the endurance of our institutions, each passing generation's sacrifice to make ours a more perfect union, the sanctity of our elections. And though this nation has continually been tested by civil war and world wars, by recessions and a depression, by searing domestic chapters and foreign misadventures, American democracy has prevailed. The mood these days is hardly triumphant, which shrouds over school children in Uvalde and grandmothers in Buffalo, with the outcome of free and fair elections denied and contested, After our purest symbol of representative democracy was stormed, our fate here has rarely felt so in flux, so tenuous. And as if all of this was not enough, this democracy and the cause of democracy recently lost its fiercest champion. When Madeleine Albright left us so suddenly in March, we lost someone who had seen the worst of communism and fascism and dedicated her entire life to helping promote human rights and accountable governance around the world. Madeleine left us many things, but among them was the gift of a brilliant op-ed she penned in October of last year, in which she tried to alert us to something that most of us, I think, have been missing. She wrote, quote, "Contrary to the conventional wisdom, the momentum is not with the enemies of democracy. In many cases, authoritarians are now failing to deliver. Democracy is not a dying cause. In fact, it is poised for a comeback," end quote. I can hear her voice in that. Now, I don't know about you, but the sentiments she expressed have not lately been that obvious to me. Maybe it's because we have grown so accustomed to yet another Freedom House report documenting democracy's decline. Maybe we're so familiar with our own setbacks and those of other established democracies that we lose sight sometimes of opportunities. Maybe we've been spending so much time trying to refute a narrative that says that dictators can deliver for their people in a way that democracies can't, that we have missed Madeleine's point. And that point is this: we have a massive opportunity before us right now. The evidence we are searching for that proves autocracies are weaker and less capable than democracies is not just in the academic studies that we pore over. It is playing out right before our eyes. Vladimir Putin's brutal war on Ukraine has shown us exactly where despotic power leads. It also reminds us just how insecure dictators who don't deliver often are. So threatened was Putin by the Ukrainian people's embrace of democracy, by their rejection of corrupt oligarchs, by their desire for deeper integration with their peaceful European neighbors, that the Russian leader rained down steel and death on its neighbor, on a people he claims are his own. The experts thought he would take Kyiv within days. The experts thought that the much vaunted Russian army would quickly overpower its weaker neighbor. But the experts forgot to take into account the costs of denying people and institutions accountable governance. They forgot that corruption has undermined the Russian military's modernization. They forgot that fear of disappointing superiors would lead generals and colonels to undertake massive risks and fall into strategic blunders. They forgot that soldiers who have been lied to and manipulated in order to force them into harm's way would lack the will to fight. And they forgot that mothers who couldn't reach their fallen sons and couldn't get information on their whereabouts would have nowhere to vent their pain or their rage. Of course, horrifyingly, this is not all we see. Bucha is just a small suburb of eastern Kyiv. It's a town few, if any, non-Ukrainians might have known. Now its name lives in infamy alongside Grozny, Aleppo, Srebrenica, Tiananmen Square, scenes of civilian massacres too profane to forget. Is this what autocratic strength looks like? Executed men lying face down in the street, their hands tied behind their backs. Ukrainian women raped and shot in their basements. Is this what it means to deliver for the Russian people? Beyond the immediate devastation within Ukraine, Putin's unprovoked war is immiserating hundreds of millions of people around the world by pulling essential food off the market and spiking fertilizer and fuel prices. As if the world's poorest did not have enough to deal with. Between the pandemic, climate shocks, and protracted conflicts, the war in Ukraine has taken 30% of the world's wheat and barley, 1/5 of its corn, and more than half of its sunflower oil offline. Putin's forces are deliberately blocking Ukraine's ports, destroying its grain, farmland, and equipment, restricting its own agricultural and fertilizer exports, and wielding hunger as a weapon of war. Ukrainian farmers are still doing all they can to grow their crops, donning flak jackets and employing demining equipment to sow their fields. But currently, as you all know, 22 million metric tons of grain are stuck in storage, with another 30 million expected from this year's harvest blockaded. Putin's forces also are now raiding the stocks that they're able to access, attempting to cash in on selling Ukraine's stolen grain to the very countries suffering most as a result of Putin's actions. The Russian government's ghastly conduct and Putin's lack of concern for the secondary impacts of Putin's war have transformed his proud nation into a pariah, more isolated than at any time since the end of the Cold War. Yet its most important strategic partner, the People's Republic of China, has not turned away. Weeks before the invasion of Ukraine, after Beijing had asked Moscow to delay its invasion until after the Winter Olympics, they declared their friendship without limits. And everywhere we see Beijing trying to limit discussions of its own human rights abuses, of its own atrocities. Global companies, from tech to fashion to film studios to sports leagues, have been bullied by Beijing, told to stay silent about the genocide in Xinjiang, where more than 1 million Uyghurs are still held against their will. In Hong Kong, the regime is ruthlessly targeting and imprisoning young students, journalists, lawmakers, and even religious leaders who dare to challenge the PRC's push to roll back personal freedoms and undermine the rule of law. Somehow, a confident leadership determined to shape a new world feels threatened by an eclectic mix of civic-minded citizens who want nothing more than a city that is more fair and just. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the country's response to the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that governments that think that order can be purchased for the price of truth are no match for the forces of nature. Since the emergence of COVID-19, as you well know, the Chinese government initially focused as much on seeking to suppress the truth as it did on suppressing the virus. Doctors who warned about the new virus were reprimanded or rounded up by local police, while online discussions were censored. In 2014, when Ukraine's corrupt Russian-backed president, Viktor Yanukovych, ignored the will of his people and refused to sign an agreement with the European Union, overwhelmingly approved by the parliament, the country's brave people spilled into the Maidan of Kyiv, and after months of protest, drove Yanukovych and his government from power. It was heralded as the revolution of dignity, the revolution of dignity. That same call for freedom, peace, and self-determination animates the battles happening in Ukraine, the civil disobedience happening in Hong Kong, and the protests that we continue to see rippling across the globe. It is that same call for dignity that autocrats seek to silence. Now, in this moment, again, a key moment, a moment of profound weakness for the world's most illiberal forces, America and all who share our values, the world's democracies, allies in the private sector, civil society, multilateral institutions, religious and diaspora communities, everyday citizens, all of us must build on the unity that we have demonstrated in Ukraine to try to extend a broader revolution of dignity to people seeking to be free. To do that, first and foremost, America's own democracy must, of course, prevail. We have to be able to pass common sense laws that can save lives. We have to forge consensus to deal with existential threats faced not just by our planet, but by our cities, our coasts, and our farms. We have to respect the outcomes of free and fair elections and uphold the tradition that we must never again take for granted in this country, the tradition of the peaceful transfer of power. Globally, as the world's two leading authoritarian powers stumble, the United States is also demonstrating to the world that America cares and that America is able to bring to bear hyper-competent, groundbreaking acts of innovation and progress. We're not using our COVID-19 vaccines to bend poor countries over a barrel or curry favor for votes at the United Nations. We are giving away effective vaccines for free. Thanks primarily to US vaccine donations, 542 million doses to date with a total of 1.2 billion committed. And thanks also to the generosity of our partners, COVID-19 vaccines are now broadly available. And we are simultaneously investing in the global health security architecture to prevent, detect, and respond to infectious disease outbreaks and pandemics, while also helping health systems recover from what they have just undergone and continue to undergo in many parts of the world with COVID. In contrast to those who are blockading ports and who are cold to the hunger and pain of millions of people around the world, the United States is investing billions of dollars, thanks also to bipartisan support in Congress, to provide humanitarian assistance to the countries on the front lines of the global food crisis in East and West Africa, helping countries at the same time break their dependence on Russian food and fertilizer supply, while ramping up our own domestic fertilizer production, protecting the poorest households around the world by scaling up social safety nets, and unleashing American know-how to spur the long-term agricultural productivity that we know is the key to ending hunger and spurring global economic growth well beyond this particular crisis. All of what I've just described is essential. But also, if the United States is to lend a helping hand to those on the front lines of freedom at what could be an inflection point remembered years from now, we also have to reimagine our approach to supporting democracy around the world. Almost exactly 40 years ago, in his Westminster address, Ronald Reagan advocated for assistance to foster the infrastructure of democracy, a free press, civil society, political parties, and universities. This was a call that led to democracy assistance as we know it. Media training and grants to independent outlets, resources to draft new laws, support for civil society, and expert guidance to administer and monitor free elections. All of this is important. It helped transform countries locked behind the Iron Curtain into proud, thriving members of a free Europe. It helped nascent democracies in Asia, Africa, and Latin America develop sustainable democratic institutions. And it will be crucial to sustaining democratic progress in the future, for sure. But as illiberal forces use new tools and technologies to spread their influence, we need to supplement those tools. We need to reinvent our playbook. In December of last year, at President Biden's first ever Summit for Democracy, the United States called on the free world to transform what it means to fight for our values on the global stage. USAID and the rest of the US government have worked to deliver on that transformation through what is called the Presidential Initiative for Democratic Renewal. And we call on all who share our values here in the United States and all over the world to join in, to extend a revolution of dignity throughout the world. And in order to do so, we must cement progress in democratic bright spots that are out there right now, help people fight digital authoritarianism, and shine a light on the oligarchs and autocrats who hide their ill-gotten gains in dark corners, and do so with great sophistication. Let me take each of those in turn. First, the bright spots. Nearly every year, and Freedom House documents this, even amidst the worrying trend lines and the prevailing narratives about autocratic ascendancy, a peaceful, pro-democracy, anti-corruption movement emerges, shaking the halls of entrenched power. Typically, that movement is violently suppressed and cut down. We've seen that in Iran, we saw it in Syria, we continue to see it in Belarus, and of course in Cuba. Occasionally, that movement breaks through, though. It establishes itself forcefully. We've seen that happen in decades past in South Africa, South Korea, Indonesia. But far too often, reformers will win an election on a platform of strengthening the rule of law, or a mass movement will succeed in toppling a repressive government, only for the democratic dream to wither as despots wrest back control, as we have seen so painfully in Sudan over the course of the last year. And with the slamming shut of a democratic opening, the dreams of protesters are diminished. Movements weaken, and the rest of the world's autocrats breathe sighs of relief. If we are to expand the circle of people living under democratic rule, then we and our democratic partners have to do all we can to secure what are often exceedingly fragile and sometimes fleeting transitions to freedom. Traditionally, we have responded to these bright spots with democracy assistance. But what a democratic bright spot may most desperately need is debt relief, shipments of wheat or vaccines, support for a more robust social safety net, particularly amid economic reforms, or even just an infusion of bureaucratic expertise so that citizens have access to basic services. These are moves that would quickly deliver tangible benefits to everyday people, people who've taken risks to usher reformers into power. In short, when people take those risks, when they bring about change by showing such courage, they expect their efforts will yield dividends, concrete dividends. And it is up to us, Democrats around the world, to do everything in our power to help reformers deliver. Otherwise, Again, these democratic windows can quickly be slammed shut as illiberal forces capitalize on disillusionment to throw up obstacles to progress. When people don't see positive, concrete changes in their day-to-day lives, they can very quickly lose confidence in their leaders and even in democracy itself. So we have to be nimble. We have to prioritize actions that can quickly offer support to bright spots, be it financial investment, technical assistance, or favorable policy reforms that we ourselves can undertake across the US government or potentially in international financial institutions or other multilaterals. At USAID, we are establishing the Partnerships for Democracy Fund and using our alliances and convening power to support the locally led ambitions of pro-democratic movements and governments. In Moldova, citizens elected their first woman president in 2020, and then last summer doubled down by delivering a landslide victory to pro-democracy and anti-corruption forces in parliament, sending a powerful message to the world and to the neighborhood that they wanted to break oligarchic control of their economy and foster closer relations with the West. Today, in addition to helping develop the country's media infrastructure and strengthening its justice system, again, traditional tactics that USAID brings to bear in such circumstances, we are helping reduce Moldova's dependence on Russian energy, and we are helping reroute exports originally due from Minsk and Moscow to European and global partners. Efforts we took, indeed recently, helped the country find a home for tens of millions of dollars of apples that were stuck in cold storage due to the Ukraine war and the Kremlin's blockade of Black Sea ports. For those apple producers, getting those exports out, 96, 97% of Moldova's apples went to Russia. Getting those apples out of cold storage, that's a livelihood issue. That matters in terms of how they view their lives, how they view their leadership. In Zambia, where I'll be traveling at the end of this month, last year's elections saw an unprecedented turnout, especially of first-time voters, women and young people, ushering in an opposition candidate, Hakainde Hichilema, who had been detained 15 times, and who pledged to reverse years of democratic backsliding, to fight corruption, and to counter inequality. Upon taking office, President Hichilema moved swiftly to fight COVID-19, address human trafficking, expand freedom for the press, end arbitrary detentions, and increase women's economic empowerment. Not only are we working to help his government enlarge civic space and strengthen free speech in the country, we are also supporting them as they decentralize procurement to local accountable actors. So money meant to hire rural teachers or restock remote health clinics isn't being skimmed off the top in the capital. And through our Global Vax initiative, we have also surged COVID-19 vaccines throughout Zambia. But aiding bright spots, needless to say, can't just be the effort of any one country, nor can it rely solely on government actors. To turn a bright spot into that enduring beacon that we all wish to see, we must elevate the challenges and opportunities that these countries present to the highest levels of other democratic governments. We have to together focus on delivering progress and not just executing development programs. We must use the policy levers at our disposal and bring together the private sector, foundations, and philanthropic actors to increase investment that can generate new and visible opportunities for citizens. These efforts have to be matched as well by country-level commitments to support social services, implement these anti-corruption reforms that have been promised, and bring those who stole from the country to justice. We also want to see not only economic growth as countries recover from the pandemic and eventually from Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the spillover effects of that, not just economic growth, but inclusive, equitable growth. And to that, again, reformist governments must commit. And the results must be delivered themselves democratically. Solutions shouldn't be decreed in capitals. They have to be informed by citizens and local institutions who get in the scrum, who support the implementation of reforms, and continue to hold governments' feet to the fire on the basis of performance. In return for these efforts, the world's democracies must embrace the goals of reformers and engaged citizens as our own, helping them achieve the short and medium-term wins that they believe are most important for improving public welfare. All fragile or transitional democracies face really hard choices and trade-offs in deciding what to prioritize. The dialogue with them will be key to determining precisely what democracy must deliver early and what we can support them in delivering. At the UN General Assembly this fall, USAID is going to host a Bright Spots Summit, bringing leaders from the public and private sectors and civil society together with governments experiencing democratic breakthroughs to help them deliver on the needs of their people. Now, to state the obvious, a focus on bright spots implies a dim backdrop, a dim map. So what can we do to support people in countries who are not experiencing a democratic breakthrough? There are more of them, many more of them. We have to help people fight the digital propaganda and surveillance systems that autocracies and less established democracies are using to assault citizens both within and outside of their borders. Though much of this technology is increasingly being developed in illicit regimes, we have to acknowledge that our homegrown innovations are also to blame, subject to often dystopian misuse. Our tech workers here in the United States are having to define their own professional ethics on the fly. They're having to develop boundaries for powerful technologies with unseen consequences. They're having to meet quarterly goals without the tools or the time to reflect on the human costs of some of this machine learning. I'm pleased to announce here that this Friday, we're going to be joining the New America Foundation to kick off an effort, a new effort by technologists, academics, and civil society to develop a code of ethics that helps put forward principles for how technology should be developed and designed to uphold democratic values and human rights. The same way doctors pledged to first do no harm, technologists need to develop a shared set of ideals that they hold dear. New America is soon going to begin convening listening sessions to launch a collaborative, inclusive process to develop this code. No government is going to draft it or own it. It obviously must be developed by technologists for technologists so that it will be upheld by technologists. We've also begun piloting our Advancing Digital Democracy Initiative, an effort to help countries strengthen their digital ecosystems so that technology advances democracy and respect for human rights. What was once a very conventional idea, now sounding more and more radical. One place we are piloting this approach is in Serbia, where the government is quietly procuring from the People's Republic of China new smart cities technologies, an increasingly popular tool billed as a way to use artificial intelligence to improve the security and efficiency of cities, but which can be exploited by governments to harass and intimidate ordinary citizens with journalists as a specific target. This is not the future that many Serbians want, so we are helping build a network of Serbian tech companies, officials, civil society organizations, universities, and advocates to raise the public's awareness of this growing danger of surveillance. This coalition will also advocate for better rules and data protections, working with principled officials who want to protect privacy and civil liberties. To take another example, authoritarians have grown increasingly clever in manipulating elections, something that we see them do in their own countries, but often also abroad, as we know too well. In the 2020s, that's where we are right now, most elections are not stolen by flagrantly stuffing ballot boxes or throwing opponents in jail. They are subtly undermined, discredited, or tilted in an incumbent's favor, often years before Election Day. Contemporary tactics, like cyber hacks, false information on social media, and questionable regulations, have undermined elections all over the world. USAID and other development agencies have supported elections for decades, but we have not always kept up with these pernicious methods, it's fair to say. That's why since the Summit for Democracy, we have gathered the world's leading organizations that support electoral integrity, some of whom are here today, both governmental and non-governmental, to form a coalition for securing election integrity, which will establish a consistent set of norms for what constitutes a free and fair election in 2022. And we'll draw from our new Defending Democratic Elections Fund to help strategically important elections meet these agreed standards throughout the election cycle. Finally, we must shine a light on the dark corners where corruption thrives and oligarchs hide their stolen wealth. Traditionally, the fight against corruption has occurred within borders, supporting the institutions and reformers fighting for transparency and accountability. But sophisticated corruption operations now, of course, increasingly cross borders. They seek out weaknesses in the global financial and regulatory systems to launder wealth and hide ill-gotten gains. This new reality requires USAID to transform its anti-corruption work, to be savvier, and to be less siloed by country. We are building coalitions of reformers across borders, sectors, and ideologies. Nowhere is this more critical than in connecting investigative journalists across countries and regions to follow the flow of illicit assets. In the past, this work focused on training these journalists in investigatory techniques, in gathering evidence, in fact-checking to support their investigations within a country. Again, that work is still absolutely mission critical, but it isn't sufficient. So we have launched regional initiatives, allowing journalists to work together across borders to piece together vast corruption scandals that span the globe, as we saw in the Panama and Pandora Papers. And in carrying out that work, today investigative journalists have as much to fear from lawsuits across jurisdictions as they arguably do from police or the oligarchs themselves. Last fall, we announced the creation of an insurance fund for investigative journalists. It's now called Reporters Mutual. What we've learned through an actuarial study since the launch is that things are even worse than we suspected. Investigative journalists are sued at 3 times the rate of all other journalists and are thus basically uninsurable on the commercial market. When I met with Filipino investigative journalist Maria Ressa, she told me that she had been hit with 22 new legal cases since she won the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize. Our new fund, which will come online next year, will provide insurance to cover the cost of defending journalists and media organizations from legal harassment. We're also uniting the private sector and civil society to safeguard one of the largest foreseeable potential sources of wealth and corruption, green energy. Countries, many of them low and middle income, are poised to capitalize on the surge of demand the world is witnessing for minerals critical for electric vehicle batteries and solar power. But they risk facing exactly the same resource curse that has plagued so many oil-rich countries. Beijing has already sought to use state-led backroom deals to capture several supply chains of critical minerals, often harming corruption and environmental standards in the process. Our initiative is going to work with the private sector and civil society to help devise industry-wide responsible mining standards and monitoring mechanisms to help prevent our clean energy future from being built with dirty minerals. And last, we're also embracing a new role for USAID in fighting corruption, partnering with other agencies across the US government to target sanctions against bad actors and kleptocrats. USAID's history with our country's various sanctions regimes has primarily been oriented toward securing licenses for humanitarian partners who provide life-saving support to people living amidst sanctioned terrorist groups or regimes. To be really, really clear, that work is going to remain essential if we're to get life-saving assistance to people who, again, are living among sanctioned individuals or institutions. But USAID has a whole array of partners, and investigative, journalists, activists, and civil society actors often have unique insights into where and how illicit gains are stashed away, and we find that they are very eager to pass that information to sanctioning authorities. Since President Biden established the Klepto Capture Task Force, which many of you have heard about, we have been working with civil society partners in Ukraine and other partner countries to identify, for example, yachts owned by Russian oligarchs and moored in Western ports, passing this information along to our colleagues at the Department of Justice and Treasury. And we're going all in on dekleptification. Today, I am announcing the creation of a new dekleptification guide, a handbook to help countries make the difficult transition from kleptocracy to democracy. This guide, drawn from previous democratic openings in Romania, Dominican Republic, and South Africa, provides advice to reformers on how to root out deeply entrenched corruption and technical advice about how to implement radical transparency and accountability measures, how to stand up new anti-corruption structures. Moving rapidly and aggressively in historic windows of opportunity will make these reforms harder to reverse. We need to seize this moment. We need to support democratic bright spots as they seek to deliver economic dividends. We need to push to counter digital authoritarianism using new tools, many more than even those I've described today. And we need to bring corruption out of the shadows, as we know it is the Achilles heel for autocrats and authoritarians. I'm going to just read you a quote here. "The free world cannot shame Russia and China into freedom, but it can inspire democracy to enrich its own freedoms. Freedom's banner will be vindicated or lost, not by the test of military strength alone, but by the purity and passion of our commitment to democracy, by our dedication to advancing the hopes of new nations, and by our determination to prove that freedom can lift the haggard burden of poverty from desolate lands," end quote. Those words, as immediate and true as they feel, to me at least today, don't belong to me. They were delivered by John F. Kennedy in 1959, just 2 years before the first segments of the Berlin Wall would be laid down at Potsdamer Platz. It would be easy, may be easy, to read those words in 2022 and despair, to feel as though little has changed in the 6 decades since, and to recognize, as we do, that the headwinds we face today are so familiar. But it would also be folly. In the same year as construction of the Berlin Wall began, USAID was founded. Over the years, the agency has been privileged to work to help billions escape a fate of dire poverty and deprivation, while helping support democratic transitions in dozens of countries. In so doing, touching the lives of billions more. Even in the most dire hours of the Cold War, where existential conflict loomed over the world and totalitarianism felt as if it was an almost permanent state of affairs in various places, the free world persisted, and eventually that wall fell. And despite the gloom of the moment, every day we see courageous people, many of them living in the most oppressive regimes on earth, taking unbelievable risks to protest for their freedom. When millions take the streets in Minsk, stare down the military in Khartoum, resist a coup in Yangon, or don all black in Causeway Bay, they remind us that no matter where the human heart beats, it beats for dignity. Today, just as the free world has come together in support of the people of Ukraine, we must come together to support Democrats worldwide. As a wise woman once said, democracy is poised for a comeback. Together, we have to seize this moment to make it happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Administrator Power, for a very hopeful speech. We're going to take some questions. I have the moderator. We're going to go for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And I will just start with one question, and then people can just raise their hands. I'll try to get to as many questions as we can. You mentioned early in the speech the issue of transnational repression, which is part of like a kind of a globalization of repression, where you see countries like Russia, China, Turkey, reaching beyond their borders to target, intimidate, harass, surveil, use digital authoritarianism, which you talked about, and even in some cases murder their critics. What can the free world do about that problem?
You're going to kill me, Michael, but you've just done a whole report on that. I want to give you an occasion to, so I'll answer, but then I'd like you to supplement. Since I know you had very precise prescriptions, and look, there's a lot one can say, and you said a lot of it in the report. So I'm really, this is not a complete answer, and I want to make sure we have time to cover a lot of ground here. One of the biggest problems that we are facing today is the fence sitter problem, and I think that amid, again, very, very difficult circumstances today, the votes at the United Nations on Ukraine, a lot of people focus on the number of African countries that abstained. Perhaps as a former UN ambassador, I study the vote counts and say, wow, look at all those African countries that actually just, because they don't like country-specific resolutions just generally, who came forward and just were sufficiently horrified at the invasion of a sovereign neighbor and at the brutality to take a stand and to take the risk associated with that. So too, again, the Gulf countries, virtually all of Latin America. I mean, it was a resounding repudiation of aggression. We see nothing like that kind of perceived collective interest in ending transnational repression. And it's partly because of China's leverage in the international system and all of the assistance that all of the loans and the debt that has been occurred, but also the Belt and Road Initiative and the infrastructure investments and so forth. And so part of what has to happen is not just bilateral pressure from the United States on countries to raise their voices even privately. It need not always be a vote at the United Nations. Certainly, you would never get the kind of vote we would wish to see on something like transnational repression if China's involved with it, or even Russia. But even privately, to be having those countries register that this is harmful, antithetical to the entire sort of reciprocal nature of the international system and the sovereign order, such as it is. But part of making that happen and making it easier for countries to stand up is, I mentioned the importance of combining competence and compassion. Our, large global infrastructure initiative, mirrored on the idea of building back better domestically, deployments by the Development Finance Corporation, harnessing the tools of the international financial institutions, being in a position to offer infrastructure investments and other, health, tech, development investments, those are investments also in giving countries the perception that they have agency to lodge objections of that nature. But I should have started by saying I'm hopeful that out of what is happening in Ukraine, that the alliance we have with our European friends will also cause Europe, broadly speaking, to be as to be very strong on this issue, again, given our collective interest in rules of the road that all of us would wish to see observed and none of us would wish to see used against our citizens.
Thank you for that.
Give a couple better answers.
Okay. I'll just say two quick things. I think making it easier for people fleeing persecution to come here so they're not trapped in other authoritarian states, so reforming the asylum system. And I would say what you talked about in your speech, targeted sanctions on the most egregious human rights abusers. And if someone is going to hunt down an Iranian American citizen here in America, we need to kind of target them. And I think that would be the two things that come top of mind.
Excellent.
To me.
Thank you.
So thank you for that opportunity. Congressman Harman, you have a question. And I think we have a microphone, so just
Jane Harman, former member of Congress, President Emerita of the Wilson Center. That was a formidable list of comments, and it's so impressive to have you as head of USAID. My question follows on your comments about fence sitters, especially that UN vote where 35 nations, mostly from the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa, abstained on the vote to condemn Russia's aggression. That vote was in the UN, and my question is specifically about the UN. Shouldn't the UN be doing more? I know there is a Russian and Chinese veto in the Security Council, but the General Assembly apparently authorized peacekeepers to Korea during the Korean War. And shouldn't they be authorizing peacekeepers now to open the channel in the Black Sea to grain deliveries, and maybe also to reduce the impact of Russian aggression to refugee flows out of Ukraine?
Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you for your life of leadership on all the issues that I touched upon in the speech. Look, it's a great question. Just to focus on, just for a beat longer on what the UN is doing, because there are a lot of different parts of the UN, operating at all times. So UN humanitarian agencies, with the support of the American taxpayer, bipartisan support, it took them some time to ramp up, but are reaching displaced persons across Ukraine, working increasingly with Ukrainian local actors, helping get cash assistance. It's not as visible as some of the assistance we see in other conflict circumstances in sub-Saharan Africa or elsewhere. It's going right into the bank accounts, and given how besieged the government is and how much they have to worry about, I don't think we should discount the work of World Food Program, UNICEF, IOM, and others, alongside, of course, our NGO partners and the Ukrainian Red Cross and others. So that's the humanitarian, that's kind of standard. They're unable, of course, to reach places where Putin won't allow them to reach. That's just what happened in Syria. You know, fundamentally, humanitarian access is the biggest challenge in contemporary conflict, is that regimes just deny it and feel no sense of shame, and there isn't enough accountability, you know, along the lines of what you're describing. So that's there. The second thing is that in addition to expelling Russia from the Human Rights Council, setting up that commission of inquiry early was very important in the sense that it gives the array of Ukrainian organizations, and it's a big consortium of organizations who are gathering evidence, providing training about how to, you know, make that evidence courtroom ready, taking depositions with, you know, again, so much of the horror still ongoing and still fresh for places that are liberated by Ukrainian forces. It's very useful that there's a receptacle that has been created in Geneva. And again, the advantage of the Human Rights Council is that there's no veto, and so it's just a question of can you mobilize the votes. And, you know, there are a lot of abstentions that you say, how could there possibly be an abstention on something like this? But countries that almost never take a stand in circumstances like this also flip. The third thing I would say, which relates to the specifics of your question, is that the United States, chaired by Secretary Blinken, convened a food security ministerial a couple weeks ago, and I think it was a very important use of America's presidency on the council, and credit Ambassador Thomas Greenfield and the Secretary for spearheading that. But one of the things that both was discussed there, and I think there was a lot of work on prior to the session and subsequent, is the Secretary General's own diplomacy to try to work to secure access to the blockaded grains and sunflower oil and so forth in Ukraine. And that session allowed African countries to give voice to the acute, existential necessity of supplies and exports flowing, you know, from Ukraine. And so that has not culminated in what we need, which is, you know, green corridors, blue corridors, whatever you call them. And we are all, you know, getting smarter on transshipment and Ukrainian rail gauges, and, you know, trying to see how much of the 5 to 6 million metric tons of exports that used to be, you know, released from Ukraine via the ports, we have to have contingency plans. And so chipping away at that, can we get that up to 2 million to 3 million through other routes? That is USAID's focus. It is the focus of the European Union and above all of the Ukrainians. But at the same time, again, that diplomacy, and particularly, again, back to my exchange with Michael, pressure from African countries who have the most to gain, where their populations are where their own planting seasons have been very, very difficult with a nearly unprecedented drought. And if you combine, you know, again, those pre-existing conditions with what Russia is doing, it's sheer devastation that no amount of humanitarian aid is going to fully be able to address. So for African countries to be adding their voices, which I think is happening, but needs to happen in a more forceful way given the stakes. When it comes to escorts, I think that's part of the conversation that is happening. And, you know, the truth is, honestly, Jane, is you could have a General Assembly Uniting for Peace resolution along the lines of what you're describing. You would still need countries willing to escort those ships if that was what was entailed. And most countries, in order to escort those ships, would want assurances from the Russian Federation that they're not going to get shot at. So I hear you, and I think, you know, we're looking at everything in light of how urgent the situation is. But at the end of the day, the Russian Federation, the cost benefit for them has to be such that they feel that the cost of allowing innocent people in sub-Saharan Africa, where they've, you know, made all kinds of media investments in fake news over the years, where the Wagner Group is active, pretending to provide security but committing war crimes. You know, Russia's over the last 10 years made significant investments across sub-Saharan Africa, And there is leverage that those governments have with the Russian Federation now that in any scenario is going to need to be exercised to make Putin feel the costs of denying people food in the way that he is currently.
Okay, I'm intuiting that we have time for one more short question. Does anyone want to
Short answer.
Have it? Go, sir.
In modern politics,
Here.
Wait for the mic.
Sorry.
in modern politics, what's the place for support for nations with fledgling or backsliding democratic institutions, but it's not fully gone yet?
In modern politics, what's the place, like what is our toolkit kind of for something in between the darkness and the, well, as a backsliding country according to Freedom House, we, you know, I think first of all, as the United States, come with humility. You know, I mean, I don't want to overstate this, but in my travels since I've been in this role, I was kind of wondering how America's message would be received, you know, on peaceful transfers of power, on respecting results of elections, and so on foreign interference in elections, election security. I may be, you know, sort of selective in how I'm processing the conversations, but on one level, I think people sort of appreciate that we're dealing with very similar challenges, and so message number one is to convey that, and don't let the elephant in the room, don't pretend that the elephant in the room isn't there. I mean, if anything, it allows us to be staring at the problem together, side by side, in a spirit of great partnership, which is always the spirit that our interlocutors, of course, want us to be engaging in. I think that you know, there's no question that among, you know, the sort of most noteworthy, I don't know, I guess what they're called, partly free, you know, countries around the world, or you know, full democracy that have slid into some other category according to Freedom House, usually there's a lot of other business to be done. You know, if you look at, there have been setbacks, of course, in India. We have a ton of existential climate work that we do with India, which means that alongside, you know, dialogue on those questions, raising, you know, concerns about backsliding that has been seen, we are in, you know, again, extremely important dialogue with them as well about hastening the transition to clean energy, about solar production. You know, we're doing a ton of work with them in the agricultural sector, and so, you know, again, recognizing that there are you know, a set of values and interests that are at stake, and linking them together and showing how important democratic accountability is to achieving, you know, the kind of emissions reductions. Because if civil society anywhere in the world, you know, feel threatened or that they can't express themselves, well, what is that going to mean, you know, at the local level, at the provincial level, at the national level, if people feel as if they can't actually, you know, hold government actors to the commitments that they have made. So you know, inevitably, there's a perception of trade-offs among competing interests and values, but I would look at it the other way, which is that there's also synergies, and that human rights, respect for human rights, is the means by which you achieve the kind of accountability on, you know, inclusive economic growth and the fight against inequality, on transitions away from fossil fuels, on education reform, on public health performance, and even pandemic surveillance. You know, how are you going to do that when you're backsliding? And it can sound like an abstraction, democratic backsliding, but when citizens feel less free and able to hold government
to account for the objectives and the goals that they've set across a range of areas. So I think, again, to silo, you know, respect for civil society or respect for human rights or democratic indicators away from objectives that every government says it's for is a mistake. And you know, again, making that case forcefully, preferably with evidence, as to how respect for human rights creates an enabling environment that makes your other goals. And then last thing I'd say is just, again, the fence sitters, doing it with our allies, the same coalition that has been mobilized for Ukraine, imperfect though it is, smaller than, of course, we think is deserved, but way bigger than we've seen in a long time, for that coalition to be mobilized as well, and for the countries that are part of that coalition to themselves be pressed to live up to their values. You know, I'm thinking, of course, of parts of Europe where some of that backsliding has been very intense.
Thank you, Administrator Power, for a very inspiring talk, and you set out a really bold agenda, so I wish you luck in implementing it, and we're there to help you with it.
Glad we have Freedom House as a partner. Thank you all, and so many of you. Thank you.